By the 1840s, in the low country of South Carolina, a strange warning moved in whispers through the slave markets of Charleston. Never buy the man with one blue eye. It sounded like nonsense in a world ruled by profit. Men who built fortunes on human misery did not scare easily. Yet this warning clung to conversations like a bad smell. By 1847, at least 17 plantation owners had purchased this one enslaved man, and every single one had sold him again within days. Not just sold. Sold at a loss. Losses so sharp they would have sunk lesser men. The pattern became impossible to ignore. No matter where he was sent, no matter who bought him, within a week his owner would be desperate to get rid of him. Some took losses of hundreds of dollars in a single transaction. A few openly admitted they would have given him away for free, just to be rid of him soon. Auction houses on Chalmers Street began refusing him altogether. Private traders tried to move him quietly, off the books, out of sight. But rumors in Charleston traveled faster than any ledger could hide. It left one question hanging in smoke-filled rooms and back offices. What could one man do? In 7 days, that would make hardened slaveholders choose financial ruin over keeping him. The first official trace of him is not in a sale record, but in a ship's manifest. On March 3rd, 1847, the Providence Dawn slid into Charleston Harbor, its wooden hull sweating salt and misery. It carried 340 enslaved Africans from the windward coast. Their names were mostly stripped away, reduced to age and condition in columns of ink. Male, female, approx 20, healthy, strong. Buried in those lines was a brief, unsettling note from the ship's surgeon, Dr. Nathaniel Grantham, male, approximately 30 years. Unusual eye coloration, heterochromia, one brown, one blue. The African exhibits no fear. This troubles me more than if he had wept. Most buyers never saw that line. For them, human beings appeared only as bodies on an auction block. But Grantham had looked closer, long enough to notice the one detail that would become legend: one brown eye, one blue dot, and the absence of fear. Charleston's slave market was a machine disguised as a city street. The auction house on Chalmers Street smelled of sweat, DMP wood, and the salt air rolling in from the harbor. Inside, there was a practiced rhythm, bodies arranged, teeth checked, muscles prodded, women and men stripped and turned under cold eyes. Buyers walked through the pens like men inspecting livestock. In that crowd, the man with one blue eye stood out without meaning to. He gave no name, and none was recorded. He was not the tallest, not the broadest, not scarred like men who had seen a lifetime of whips. But traders found themselves looking at him, then quickly looking away, as if they'd stared at the sun a second too long. When the auctioneer ordered him to demonstrate his strength, he complied. Not with false humility, not with dramatics. Just clean, efficient movement, lifting, turning, holding. When a trader ran practiced hands along his arms and ribs, checked his teeth, and searched his back for signs of rebellion. He stood completely still. His mismatched eyes were fixed somewhere far beyond the walls of the auction house, on something no one else could see. Samuel Pritchard bought him for $1.100. To understand the weight of that number, you have to understand Pritchard. He was not a fool, not a gambler, and certainly not a man guided by superstition. He'd taken 800 acres of mosquito-infested swampland and turned them into one of the most profitable rice plantations in the region. Every decision he made had a calculation behind it. He saw a strong, healthy man at prime working age. No obvious scars from punishment, no signs of illness. Demand for field labor was high. The price reflected that. Pritchard paid it without blinking. As he did with all people he claimed as property. He handed out a name carelessly, as if he were tagging inventory. Call him Isaac. No record shows the man objecting. No record shows him agreeing. The name simply stuck. Like every other theft in his life, Marsh Haven Plantation was built on geometry and controlled. The rice fields stretched out in ordered lines. A grid carved into stolen marshland channels and levees that turned swamp into gold. About 200 enslaved, People worked those fields under a system that had been refined over generations. Drivers kept pace and enforced order. Overseers rode horseback, their whips cracking through the air like punctuation. The threat of sale and separation hung over everything. Families split in a heartbeat. Children sold to strangers, spouses torn apart forever. The quarters were rough cabins in neat rows, their symmetry hiding the chaos of grief and exhaustion inside. Each cramped space housed multiple families. Bodies pressed together at night to escape the damp and the cold. With barely enough room for sleep, Isaac was placed in one of these cabins with 7 others. That first night, according to later testimony from a woman named Rebecca, he said almost nothing. He took the ration of cornmeal and salt pork, ate in silence, and watched. When others gossiped, complained, or whispered fears, he listened with an intensity that made them uneasy. Years later, when Rebecca was an old woman being interviewed by a northern researcher, she struggled to describe it. "It was that blue eye," she said. "Not magic, no. Folks like to say that, but it weren't that. It was like he was reading words written on your soul words. He didn't know how to read yourself." Life at Marsh Haven started long before sunrise. At 4 a.m., the horn blew. By 4:30, the enslaved were knee-deep in water, backs bent, hands blistered by sharp-edged rice stalks. The fields ate people slowly: fever, infections, exhaustion, but profit smoothed the edges of every obituary in the owner's minds. Pritchard liked to boast that he kept order without excess. In his mind, that meant punishments were methodical, not impulsive. Whippings were recorded in ledgers. Broken bodies were written down as losses. Everything had a number, a category, a reason, into this machine. Isaac slipped like a gear that should have turned smoothly and somehow didn't. He learned the rhythm of cutting rice in hours. By the second day, he matched the pace of men who had done it all their lives. He never slacked. He never rushed to impress. He worked with a mechanical precision that left overseers with nothing to correct and nothing to praise. He was not rebellious. He was not submissive. He was simply there, not working, eating, sleeping, rising, working again. And yet, by the 4th day, something in the air at Marsh Haven had changed. No fights broke out. No tools went missing. No obvious act of defiance occurred. But conversations in the quarters grew quieter when Isaac was mentioned. Drivers hesitated in their duties without knowing why. Even the overseer, Clayton Hobbs, found his temper shorter and his sleep thinner. He could not have said what was wrong. Only that something was. On the morning of Isaac's 6th day at Marsh Haven, Hobbs did something he never did. He went to the big house early. Pritchard's house servant, Daniel, would later say that the overseer's hands were trembling as he asked, almost begged to speak with the master at once. Hobbs, who had personally whipped men until their backs were raw, looked like someone who'd seen a ghost. What they spoke about in Pritchard's study was never written down. People in the house heard raised voices, a sharp word from Pritchard, low and strained responses from Hobbs, then silence. Then footsteps within the hour. Clayton Hobbs rode away from Marsh Haven. He left behind his post, his pay, and 2 months of salary he could have claimed by finishing his contract. His wife returned days later to collect his belongings. To anyone who asked, she said only, "Clayton has taken a position in Georgia." The Plantation Journal shows no explanation. Only a single line. Overseer Hobbs resigned suddenly. No incident recorded. That same day, Pritchard did something else out of character. He went to the fields himself. Owners rarely appeared there without warning. Their presence bent the air around them. Drivers stood straighter. Overseers barked louder. Field hands worked faster, even when there was no speed left in their bodies. Pritchard walked directly to the third field gang and spoke briefly with Isaac. No one heard what was said. Those close enough to watch later remembered only that Isaac stood still, muddy water around his shins, scythe in hand, and listened calmly as the master spoke. He did not bow. He did not stare. He simply listened. Pritchard turned and walked back to the house. That night, His wife mentioned in a letter to her sister that Samuel had taken ill with some disturbance of the nerves and locked himself in his study with a bottle of whiskey on the seventh day after buying Isaac. After paying $1,100 for him and assigning him to his carefully calculated system, Samuel Pritchard broke all his own rules. He took Isaac back to Charleston. No delay, no test, no further thought. He sold him for $800. When the buyer, a man named Joseph Merriweather, asked if there was any defect in the enslaved man to justify such a loss, Pritchard gave a curt, strange answer that made its way into the sale document. No physical defect. I simply have no further use for him. He did not elaborate. Perhaps he could not dot by the time Isaac left Charleston again, headed for a turpentine camp in the Pine Barrens. The pattern had begun. The man with one blue eye had stayed only 7 days at Marsh Haven. He had never raised a hand, never refused an order, never spoken a single word of rebellion. And yet, a seasoned overseer had run, a profitable planter had taken a crushing loss, and the first whisper had taken root in Charleston. Never purchase the man with one blue eye. Joseph Merriweather, the man who bought Isaac from Samuel Pritchard, prided himself on practicality. He ran a turpentine operation in the Pine Barrens north of Georgetown, a dangerous, brutal business where men worked in small crews, tapping resin from trees, carrying buckets of pitch, and tending to stills that exploded often enough to make new workers flinch every time one hissed dot on like rice planters. Merriweather didn't care much for philosophy or appearances. He measured men by their use. Who can work? Who can obey? Who can survive the heat? Isaac, quiet and strong, seemed like a bargain at $800. During their journey from Charleston, Merriweather noticed nothing unusual. Isaac walked when told, rested when ordered, ate when permitted. He spoke little, but that wasn't uncommon. Men ripped from plantation to plantation rarely talked to their new owners in camp. Merriweather placed him with an experienced crew and returned to his routines. For 3 days, everything was perfectly normal. Isaac learned quickly how to score the bark, how to collect resin, how to keep his footing on slick pine roots. He worked steadily, neither rushing nor lagging, and he created no disturbances among the other enslaved men. But on the 4th day, a familiar pattern began. Unease without cause, Merriweather couldn't sleep at night. He described it later as a hollow stirring, a sense not of danger, but of wrongness. He paced the camp's main path until dawn, checking the stills, checking the cabins, checking the tools, searching for some practical explanation. There was none on the 5th day. 2 of his enslaved workers came to him not to complain, which they rarely dared, but to ask quietly, urgently, to be reassigned to a different crew. When Merriweather demanded a reason, they couldn't provide one. Something ain't right about him, one finally said. Trembling Dot, and that was all. That night, Merriweather sat alone in his cabin, staring at his account books. He felt the same crawling unease he'd dismissed in Pritchard's behavior. His numbers didn't balance. His planning felt suddenly foolish, childish even. His own handwriting looked strange, as if some other man had written it by morning of the 6th day. He understood the truth. He wanted Isaac gone, not because of any threat, not because Isaac had done anything wrong, but because Isaac's presence made the world feel slightly but undeniably off balance. Merriweather was a practical man, and the practical solution was simple. Sell him, immediately. A desperate sale Merriweather rode to Charleston with Isaac the next morning, refusing to stop for food or rest. At the market, he sold him for $750 to Benjamin Ruddled, a rice factor who bought and sold enslaved people for planters along the coast. When Ruddled pressed him, why the rush? Why the loss? The bill of sale recorded only 2 words. Seller expressed urgency. He did not look back when he left Isaac there. He did not sleep that night either. The pattern emerges by late April. The story of Isaac had already become something rare in the slave markets of Charleston, a mystery that made traders nervous to speak too loudly. Isaac had now been sold 6 times in 6 weeks. Not once had he been whipped for cause. Not once had he tried to run. Not once had he shown violence, illness, or disobedience, and yet every owner had been unable to keep him more than a handful of days. Financial losses mounted. $300 lost by Pritchard, $50 lost by Merriweather, $200 lost by others, whose names trickled quietly through market gossip. Some sales happened in back rooms, some on porches, some behind locked office doors where men whispered and refused to meet each other's eyes. One planter, Thomas Cunningham, sold Isaac for half price after only 5 days. When a colleague asked him why, he spoke a sentence that would echo across the markets for months. I would have paid someone to take him, just to have him gone. By May, Isaac's presence had become so unsettling that auction houses refused to accept him, sending him away with nervous excuses. Private dealers on Vanderhorst Wharf shook their heads before he even stepped off a wagon. It was as if the entire city had agreed on one unspoken conclusion. Isaac was not SALBLE. Not because of anything he did, but because of what he made men feel. Theories, rumors, and fear whispers began to coil through Charleston. Disease? No physicians confirmed his health. Witchcraft? Ridiculous white elites scoffed African superstitions. Madness? No, he was calm, polite, intelligent, but still, men avoided him. Dr. Marcus Fairchild, a physician fascinated by the mind, wrote privately to a colleague, multiple men of business reputation behave irrationally after brief exposure to this slave. What mechanism produces such consistent effects? He never found an answer. Instead, something else emerged. Fear, not fear of rebellion, not fear of violence, but fear of something worse. Slave who made masters feel something they had spent their entire lives suppressing. Guilt, the question no one wanted to ask traders, began speaking quietly in back rooms. Voices hushed like men sharing a ghost story. Isaac never threatened, never resisted, never argued. He simply existed, and somehow his existence alone seemed to crack open the minds of the men who owned him, forcing them, even briefly, to see themselves clearly. That was the terror. Not that Isaac might rebel, but that he might make them see the truth of who they were. By the beginning of June, when Isaac was sold for the 11th time, his market value had dropped to $400 less than half his original price, and yet sellers still lost money. Just to get rid of him, the question that haunted Charleston grew sharper. What does the man with one blue eye do to his masters? And why do none of them dare to speak the truth aloud? By early June 1847, Isaac had drifted through so many hands that Charleston's traders no longer bothered asking about his skills or health. They already knew the answer. He worked well, obeyed orders, and showed no outward flaw. The real question why every owner became desperate to sell him was something no white man seemed willing to put into words. It was at this point that Josiah Tamain, a cotton factor known for his meticulous records and rigid logic, became intrigued. Slave traders whispered too much, plantation owners stuttered too often, and the pattern of financial loss was too consistent to ignore. To Tamain, the situation was less a curiosity and more an insult to the orderly systems that governed the slave economy. So he began an investigation. His first step was to question the owners themselves, but they gave him nothing. Pritchard muttered only about lost confidence. Merriweather claimed incompatibility with camp operations. Ruddled avoided specifics entirely. Every man spoke in vague phrases, as though the true reasons hovered just behind their teeth, but refused to emerge. Tamain, frustrated by their evasions, turned to an unusual source, the enslaved people who had worked beside Isaac. It was a strange reversal. White men of the South did not ask enslaved people for explanations. But this mystery required answers, and enslaved people were the only ones telling the truth. The first testimony came from Rebecca, the woman who had shared a cabin with Isaac at Marsh Haven. She told Tamain, in a quiet corner of the quarters, that Isaac never preached rebellion, never spoke against the masters, never told anyone what to think. But when he looked at you with that one blue eye, she whispered you saw something inside yourself that you had never dared to face. She insisted it was not magic. It was simply the way he looked, calm and unafraid, as if he knew every secret you hid from others, and even from yourself. For white men, she said softly, what they really are must be a terrible thing to see. Another enslaved man, Jacob, who had worked with Isaac in the turpentine camps, described a similar experience. Isaac could listen to a man talk for only minutes and somehow know everything that man feared. He never used the knowledge to threaten anyone. He didn't have to. The knowledge itself was the threat. Jacob admitted that even he sometimes felt exposed under Isaac's gaze, not judged, but understood too deeply. And if an enslaved man felt that, how much worse must it have been for the slaveholders who had built their entire lives on lies? But the most detailed testimony came from Phyllis, a house servant in the home of Benjamin Ruddled. She recounted an event that became pivotal in Talmain's understanding. On Isaac's fourth day in the household, Ruddled summoned him to the study for questioning. Phyllis entered the room to serve tea and overheard their exchange. Ruddled, increasingly agitated by his own unease, asked Isaac directly what he did to unsettle men. Isaac's answer was polite, almost gentle. I do nothing, sir. I work as instructed. If my presence causes discomfort, perhaps you should consider why that might be so. Phyllis recalled how the color drained from Ruttled's face. It was not the words themselves. They were respectful, but the implication behind them. A mirror held up to a man who had avoided looking at himself for years. Ruddled dismissed Isaac immediately, and within 2 days, sold him at a considerable loss. These testimonies left Talmain shaken. He had expected tales of violence or disobedience, something physical, something measurable. Instead, he found that Isaac's power came from something far more dangerous. He understood the internal machinery of slavery, the fear, guilt, and self-deception that allowed owners to justify their own cruelty. And by simply existing, by refusing to shrink or pretend, he made those justifications collapse. Talmain realized that the greatest threat to the slave system was not rebellion, escape, or violence. It was clarity, a single man who saw slaveholders for what they truly were and made them see themselves in return. That he understood at last was why Isaac had to be sold again, and again, and why none of the men who sold him could bear to explain why. Isaac's trail through. The Low Country might have ended in quiet obscurity, if not for the man who came next. After his 11th sale, when his price had sunk to less than half its original value, a Charleston merchant named William Thorne finally found a buyer willing or arrogant enough to take him. That buyer was Davies Fletcher, owner of Riverside Plantation, a remote cotton operation near the Savannah River. Fletcher was known even among slaveholders for his extreme cruelty. Where other planters spoke of discipline and efficiency, Fletcher ruled by terror. Injuries were common, deaths unremarked, and the enslaved at Riverside spoke his name with the kind of fear usually reserved for storms or demons. When Thorne warned Fletcher of Isaac's past, Fletcher laughed a harsh, cutting sound that made even the traders in the room go quiet. I've broken worse men than him, he said. He'll fall in line like the rest. Isaac arrived at Riverside in late June, and Fletcher wasted no time asserting dominance. In front of the entire enslaved population, he had Isaac stripped and inspected. A ritualized humiliation meant to erase dignity and establish power. But Isaac did not react, no trembling, no pleading, no visible shame. He simply stood there, calm and upright, while Fletcher studied him with growing irritation. When the inspection failed to provoke the expected fear, Fletcher assigned Isaac to the most punishing work detail, clearing new ground in suffocating heat, with barely enough water to keep a man standing. It was a test designed to break spirit, body, or both. Isaac endured it without complaint. For the first week at Riverside, the only visible change came not from Isaac, but from those around him. Sullivan, Fletcher's overseer, A brutal man who had overseen countless beatings began behaving strangely. He found himself avoiding Isaac without meaning to. He hesitated before issuing punishments when Isaac was in sight. He felt, for the first time in his career, something like shame. He confessed as much to Fletcher after days of growing unrest in his own mind. "He does nothing wrong," Sullivan said, struggling with the words. "But when he looks at me, I feel judged. Not by him, by myself." Fletcher flew into a rage at this confession, offended that any slave could make his overseer, man, shaped in cruelty, feel anything so dangerously human, determined to crush whatever invisible influence Isaac carried. Fletcher staged a public punishment. On Isaac's 25th day at Riverside, he ordered the entire enslaved population to assemble behind the main house. Isaac's wrists were tied to the whipping post. Fletcher himself took the whip, something rare, as owners usually left such tasks to overseers. He delivered the first lash with practiced force. Isaac did not cry out. Fletcher struck again. Still nothing. Lash after lash tore into Isaac's back 10 strokes. Then 15, then 20, each one building Fletcher's fury and sapping his strength. Isaac never flinched, never bowed, never screamed. He simply stood, eyes fixed on the horizon, mismatched and UNBL INK dot by the 25th blow. It was Fletcher, not Isaac, who broke. Witnesses later said Fletcher began to tremble, then to sob openly, the whip slipping from his fingers as the enslaved people stared in stunned silence. No one had ever seen a master cry. Fletcher stumbled back into the house without a word, slamming the door behind him. For the next week, he barely slept. He wandered his property at night, muttering to himself, unable to bear the sound of his own thoughts. His wife wrote to her sister that Davies had become melancholy beyond reason, and spoke in riddles she could not understand. 7 days after the whipping, Fletcher ended his life with a pistol in his study. His family sealed the note he left behind, but rumors soon revealed the single sentence written inside: "I have seen what I am." His suicide thundered through South Carolina's planter class. These were men who believed themselves pillars of civilization, chosen by God to rule. Their whole world rested on certainty, certainty of hierarchy, certainty of superiority, certainty of righteousness. For one of their own to take his life because of a slave was more terrifying than any knife. Any uprising, any rebellion, Isaac was sold again within 3 days, this time by Fletcher's estate administrator. The administrator lasted barely 72 hours before finding a traitor, heading west and insisting he take Isaac off his hands. That traitor kept him for only 2 days before fleeing the responsibility himself, passing Isaac to another dealer in Georgia. The cycle continued. Isaac moved through Tennessee, then Kentucky, each transaction accompanied by hastening fear and accelerating losses. No one could keep him. No one could stand him. No one could explain why. And yet, as Isaac traveled from plantation to plantation, something else began to spread quietly, invisibly, dangerously. Among the enslaved, the story of the man with one blue eye took on life. Not a ghost story. Not a superstition. A lesson. A whisper passed through work lines in nighttime. Cabins. There exists a slave who can make masters see the truth of themselves. And that truth, once seen, cannot be endured. Isaac never spoke rebellion. He never lifted a hand in violence. But his very presence showed enslaved people something they had always suspected, that the power their masters held was built on fragile lies. That the men who claimed strength lived in fear of being truly seen, and that a single clear gaze could shatter an empire of domination. Riverside had not broken Isaac. Riverside had broken Fletcher. And the South was beginning to understand that Isaac's greatest weapon was not resistance. It was reflection. By September 1847, Isaac had been bought and sold 23 times. His journey had carried him through 6 states, each new owner keeping him for a handful of days before panic or despair pushed them to sell him at a loss. His price had fallen to $200, barely more than the cost of a mule. Yet Even at that low sum, men hesitated to take him. Isaac was no longer a person in a trade. He had become a problem, an omen, a weight no one could bear for long. But while the white world recoiled from him, the enslaved world had begun to hum with a different kind of energy across plantations, cotton fields, rice swamps, turpentine camps, and river docks. A story began to move not openly, never loudly, but through songs, coded lines, whispered conversations in night cabins, and glances exchanged between passing work gangs. The enslaved had always communicated beneath the notice of the masters. Now the name of the man with one blue eye spread like heat through summer grass. They spoke of Isaac as a man who needed no weapon, no plan, no rebellion to strike fear into slaveholders. All he did was exist, and in doing so, make the masters see themselves clearly. For a people whose lives depended on understanding white behavior, Isaac's gift was more powerful than any uprising. He revealed the cracks in the foundation. Reverend Aldrich Hayes, a minister who preached to several plantation parishes in Mississippi, noticed the change long before any planter admitted it. In his diary that summer, he wrote of an unsettling confidence among the enslaved population, a shift in posture, in eye contact, and the way they carried themselves. Not the kind of unrest that led to open rebellion, but something quieter, more profound. They speak in riddles about seeing truly, he wrote. A disturbing phrase repeated often. I fear a new form of resistance is emerging, one I do not understand. Hayes thought he was witnessing a spiritual movement. He had no idea he was watching the aftermath of Isaac's passage through the South. White men assumed rebellion required weapons and conspiracies. They prepared for knives, fire, poison, or flight. But they had no preparation for a rebellion of perception, for the idea that enslaved people might understand them more clearly than they understood themselves. Plantation power relied on certainty, the certainty that the master was strong, wise, ordained, unquestionable. Isaac's presence revealed a truth slaveholders could not stomach. Their authority was a performance. An enslaved eyes saw through it. For the enslaved, this revelation was electric. Isaac never encouraged escape. He never urged violence. He did not preach. But the knowledge he embodied that the masters were not gods, not giants, not unbreakable was enough to reshape the inner life of everyone who heard his story. On some plantations, enslaved people walked with a little more confidence. On others, they stopped pretending quite so convincingly. A few drivers refused to whip as harshly. Some field hands stopped lowering their eyes. Automatically, when a white man passed, these were tiny gestures, too subtle for most planters to notice, but each was a chip in the psychological armor the slave system needed to survive. And for the men who had owned Isaac, the damage was worse. Samuel Pritchard, once proud of his plantation's perfect order, began reading abolitionist literature in secret and eventually sold the land he had spent decades building. Benjamin Ruddled quietly manumitted enslaved people and found himself shunned by Charleston society. Joseph Merriweather fled west and abandoned the entire profession. Isaac had never raised a hand to them. He had simply shown them themselves. Even the traders who carried him from one market to another felt the ghost of that clarity. Stories drifted through Charleston's coffee houses about slave dealers who left the business, boat captains who changed routes, overseers who abruptly resigned and disappeared. No one said Isaac's name in public, but every man knew. Yet, the most dangerous shift was happening not among individuals, but within the system itself. Slaveholders had always believed their authority rested on force chains, whips, guns, laws. But Isaac exposed a deeper truth. The system survived because the enslaved allowed it to feel legitimate. Because they performed submission, because they pretended their owners were stronger than they truly were. Isaac's calm presence stripped away that illusion. And once the illusion cracked, it could not be easily repaired. And so the South, without realizing it, had become vulnerable in a way it never been before. Not to rebellion from below, but to collapse from within. Isaac had made men see that their dominance was built on lies, and that knowledge poisoned their certainty. he had become a quiet fire moving from plantation to plantation, leaving no scars on the land, but burning something vital in the hearts of those who claimed power over him. By the time the traders gathered in Charleston to discuss his fate, the planter class had already reached a single, unspoken conclusion. Isaac could not be allowed to remain anywhere in the South. His body had been bought and sold, chained and transported, whipped and examined. But his true danger lay in something far simpler, a gaze that made men see the truth. The slaveholders would rather bury him in the most brutal plantation of Texas than risk one more spark. And they believed, foolishly, that distance would extinguish him. By late November 1847, the planter class in Charleston had reached a silent consensus. Isaac was not merely troublesome, not merely strange, he was dangerous in a way that no whip, no law, and no sale could contain. Slaveholders feared rebellion, but they feared something far worse in Isaac: clarity. If one enslaved man could shake the certainties of dozens of owners simply by existing, what would happen if others learned to do the same? The whispered question hung over Charleston's private clubs and counting houses like a storm cloud no one wanted to acknowledge. And so a plan was formed, not publicly, not officially, but through a series of discreet meetings among some of the city's wealthiest men. A consortium pooled money to purchase Isaac for one final time, paying $150, less than the price of a mule for a man who had cost them thousands in accumulated losses. Their intention was not to use him, nor to resell him, but to remove him from circulation entirely. They chose Texas, not the settled regions, but the deep pine woods of East Texas, near the Louisiana border, an area so remote that news and stories took months to travel. There, in the brutal isolation of Bitter Creek Plantation, they hoped Isaac's unsettling influence would disappear into the mud, heat, and mortality of cotton country. The plantation belonged to Silas Garrett, a man whose brutality made even other slaveholders uneasy. Garrett believed slaves were cheaper to replace than to maintain, and he worked them accordingly. Mortality rates in his fields were infamous, not that he cared. He had built his entire life on the belief that cruelty was efficiency, and that fear was the only discipline worth trusting. To the consortium, Garrett was perfect. Isaac, they assumed, would break there, or die. Either outcome, they believed, would rid the South of a growing threat before his transport to Texas. Isaac was held in a New Orleans slave pen run by Morris Dufresne, a man who documented his human cargo the way others recorded crates or barrels. Dufresne, instructed by the consortium, kept Isaac isolated from other enslaved people. He was a product to be contained rather than displayed, a problem to be stifled in storage. Isaac spent 2 weeks in a small room with a barred window overlooking the courtyard. Yet even in isolation, he observed. He watched the daily brutality of the pen, the screams during inspections, the quiet sobbing of families torn apart, the calculating eyes of traders who treated human beings like furniture. And he watched the men who worked there, noting their movements, their hesitations, the cracks beneath their hardened expressions. One of Dufresne's employees, Thomas Webb, was assigned to guard Isaac. Webb had spent 15 years as an overseer before drifting into slave pen work, carrying with him a history he rarely allowed himself to remember. At first, he treated Isaac with the same mechanical detachment he had shown thousands of others. But Isaac had a way of drawing out confessions without asking for them, of unsettling a man simply by listening. Webb later described their conversations as simple questions, but questions that peeled back layers he had spent years burying. Isaac did not scold him or preach to him. He merely asked things like, would you treat a white child the way you treat those in chains? And what do you tell your wife when she asks about your work? Webb had no answers. Or rather, he had answers he could not bear to say aloud. By the end of Isaac's stay, Webb found himself changed. On the night before the scheduled transport, Isaac said something that Webb remembered for the rest of his life. You have a choice that enslaved people don't. You can walk away. That makes you more responsible, not less. The next morning, Webb didn't report for duty. He left New Orleans entirely. He would later admit that Isaac didn't persuade him, he merely made him see himself. Dufresne, too, was shaken. He had barely spoken to Isaac, yet he found the man's quiet presence gnawing at the walls of his certainty. Within 3 months of Isaac's departure, he sold his slave pen, moved north, and never returned to the trade again. On December 10th, Isaac was loaded onto the steamboat Tempest Grace, bound upriver toward Shreveport. For the first time in all his months of captivity, he was chained not because he had tried to escape, but because the men transporting him no longer trusted anything else to contain him. The chains were heavy, cold iron, anchored to a post in the cargo hold. But the chains were less about Isaac, and more about the fear he triggered in those who touched the system that held him. Terence Walsh, the captain of the Tempest's Grace, was a practical man who had spent 20 years navigating the Mississippi. He prided himself on efficiency, discipline, and a deliberate indifference to the nature of his cargo. To him, enslaved people were freight, unfortunate freight perhaps, but freight nonetheless. When Walsh moved Isaac from the crowded cargo hold to a small storage room near his own cabin, he claimed it was because the iron post in the main hold was needed for other cargo. But his later writings suggest a deeper reason. Isaac unsettled him. Though he could not yet admit it, during the long, slow push upriver, Walsh visited the storage room often. Their conversations ranged from river navigation to politics to philosophy. Isaac asked questions, gentle, precise questions that Walsh struggled to answer. And each answer, each attempted justification, sounded thinner than the last. By December 19th, Walsh was trembling beneath the weight of truths he had spent 2 decades refusing to see. In his log that night, he wrote, "If I am a man who transports other men in chains, knowing them to be men, what does that make me?" His final entry before the incident was a single sentence. "I have made a decision that will cost me my livelihood and reputation. But this is easier to bear than living with what I am." Somewhere on the Mississippi, on a cold night in late December, Isaac's chains were removed. Whether Walsh led him to the riverbank or into the forested darkness of Arkansas, no one can say for certain. The official report claimed Isaac escaped. The crew members told a different story in later years, that Walsh freed him, gave him food, maybe money, and watched him disappear into the night dawning for the first time since his capture on the windward coast. Isaac walked away towards something that might have been freedom. Isaac vanished into the darkness of an Arkansas riverbank on a winter night in December 1847. And with that single step, his story left the boundaries of official records and entered the realm of rumor, memory, and fear. The consortium that had funded his transport reacted with outrage when Walsh delivered his report in Shreveport. They demanded answers, demanded reimbursement, demanded punishment. But nothing came of it. Walsh stuck to his story that the slave had slipped his chains and fled the boat, and without a body. No court could prosecute him for negligence. Still, the riverboat captain resigned from his position at once and quietly returned to Pennsylvania. He told no one his reasons, at least not in words. But the man who had spent 2 decades ferrying human cargo north and south never again set foot on a Mississippi steamer. Isaac's disappearance should have ended the matter. A slave gone missing in the wilds of Arkansas was hardly noteworthy in official circles, and most runaways were never seen again. But Isaac was no ordinary runaway. Over the next months and years, small ripples began to move through the south and north, alike unconnected at first glance, yet unmistakably shaped by the wake he left behind. Plantation records showed that nearly every man who had owned Isaac experienced some dramatic change. Samuel Pritchard abandoned Marsh Haven, moved north, and immersed himself in abolitionist literature. Benjamin Ruddle freed or sold most of the people he had enslaved and began writing public letters advocating gradual emancipation. Joseph Merriweather abandoned the turpentine business entirely and fled west during the gold rush, leaving behind a life he had once considered permanent and necessary. Even men who had only briefly come into contact with Isaac were transformed. A slave trader abruptly closed his Charleston business and shifted to shipping. A New Orleans overseer disappeared from the city entirely. A physician's practice changed course and turned into a crusade against the very system he once accepted without question. These were not rebellions or dramatic speeches or heroic public stands. They were quiet unnervings, an inward unraveling that began the moment they had met Isaac's eyes and realized the ground beneath their certainty was not as solid as they believed. While white men crumbled, the enslaved people whispered. Stories of Isaac's escape spread not as a tale of daring flight, but as a parable of something deeper, the belief that the slave system, for all its brutality, could be shaken not just by force, but by truth. Some said he had reached the north, escorted by free people of color and abolitionists along hidden paths. Others claimed he had joined marooned communities deep in the swamps. A few insisted he had returned to Africa aboard a sympathetic ship. The details changed with each telling, but one part remained constant. Isaac had not died. Isaac had walked free in the slave quarters of Louisiana. Children sang a verse about the man with mismatched eyes who made masters tremble without lifting a hand. In Mississippi, an old driver told younger men that Isaac's power was not magic, but the kind of sight that recognized hypocrisy and forced men to face it. In Georgia, enslaved field workers passed along a quiet message that truth, once seen, could not be unseen. The legend of Isaac became less about the man himself and more about the force he represented, the idea that enslaved people possessed minds sharper than the chains meant to confine them, and that slaveholders were far weaker, far more fragile than their violence suggested. Meanwhile, in the cities of the North, hints of Isaac appeared like loose threads. In 1852, Frederick Douglass wrote in a letter that he had met a remarkable African man who spoke of slavery's psychological machinery with an insight Douglass had never encountered. He did not name the man, nor did he give a description, but the timing and the tone left future scholars wondering. Others claimed to have met him briefly, an educated African who traveled quietly, never staying in one place long enough to draw attention, yet leaving a particular impression on everyone who spoke with him. The South, however, tried to erase him. Newspapers avoided his story. Traders refused to speak his name. Planters whispered about him only in private, fearful that acknowledging him would admit something too dangerous, that the system they depended on was not unshakable power, but a fragile illusion. And they feared the enslaved even more, not because the enslaved might rebel, but because the enslaved might understand. Isaac had not sparked uprisings. He had not planned escapes. He had never shouted, never fought back, never openly defied. But his presence had revealed the deepest secret of all, that the masters themselves lived in fear of judgment, fear of truth, fear of the day when the enslaved would stop pretending to believe the lies that held the entire world in place. Isaac was gone. But the unraveling he began was far from over. In the years that followed, as the South's arguments for slavery grew more brittle, more frantic, more shrill, some sensed that something had cracked long before talk of secession. Something had shifted inside the planter class, a frailty, a doubt, a tremor in the heart of men who once claimed their rule was ordained and eternal. And if you look closely, you could trace that crack all the way back to one man with one brown eye and one blue walking quietly through the American South, seeing it more clearly than it had ever seen itself. Isaac disappeared from the riverbank in December 1847 and was never officially found again. To the slave traders, his escape was an irritant. To the planters who had owned him, it was a relief they could not admit aloud. To the legislature of South Carolina, it was a warning whispered behind closed doors. But to the enslaved people of the South, those who sang in the fields, whispered in quarters, and carried news across plantations, it was the beginning of something far larger than one man's fate in the years after Isaac vanished. The men who had handled him continued to unravel in quiet, telling ways. Pritchard, once proud, wealthy, and utterly certain of his righteousness, had abandoned his plantation and resettled in Philadelphia, telling his family he could not live anymore, at war with what I know. Ruddled withdrew from planter society and became a quiet advocate for emancipation, writing letters that would circulate among northern circles and be reprinted cautiously in abolitionist journals. Terence Walsh, the riverboat captain, spent the remainder of his life aiding fugitives, guiding them through river routes, coaching them on geography, passing them from one safe hand to another with the solemn precision of a man atoning for every mile he had once ferried chains. Dr. Nathaniel. Brantham became the most visible transformation. His writings on the moral cost of human bondage appeared in anti-slavery papers across the North, though he never named Isaac. Every sentence in his essays carried the unmistakable echo of that 15-day encounter. The clear-eyed African who dismantled a lifetime of rationalizations with quiet conversation. Grantham's essays helped shape the psychological arguments of the abolitionist movement in the 1850s, influencing readers who believed slavery corrupted not only the enslaved, but the enslavers themselves. Meanwhile, the South grew more defensive, more brittle. The laws passed in 1848, 1849, cracking down on literacy. Forbidding education, increasing surveillance were put forward as security measures. But those who had been present at the quiet November meetings in Charleston knew the truth. These laws were born from the deep, private fear that another Isaac could emerge. A slave whose intelligence, clarity, and composure could unravel a man's certainty without a single act of rebellion. A slave who exposed the whole system for what it was. Not a natural order, but a fragile lie held together by fear and self-deception. And among the enslaved, Isaac became legend, not a ghost story, not a miracle, but a symbol proof that even the most powerful slaveholder could be undone not by violence, but by truth. In the quarters, elders told children about the man with the one blue eye who saw straight into the heart of things. Songs carried his story and coded verses, one eye brown and one eye blue, seeing things the masters do. His name traveled down river lines, across tobacco farms, up into the Carolinas, into Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia. For some, Isaac represented hope. For others, he represented knowledge. But for all, he represented something dangerous, the idea that the enslaved understood the world of slavery more clearly than the slaveholders themselves. As the 1850s unfolded, the South's political arguments grew more frantic, more desperate. Slaveholders demanded new laws, new protections, new assurances that their world would remain intact. They shouted louder not because they were stronger, but because they sensed, deep down, that something was slipping beneath their feet. And though no historian traced the connection, though no political document bore his name, a small part of that tremor could be traced back to Isaac, a man who had spent 8 months quietly dismantling the psychological foundations of slavery simply by refusing to participate in its illusions. The final mystery, what became of him, has no certain answer. He may have drowned in the Mississippi, chains weakening his body until the river took him. He may have reached a hidden safe house operated by free people of color. He may have made his way north, crossed into Canada, and lived under another name. Or perhaps he traveled back to Africa, returning to the coast from which he had been stolen. A letter from Frederick Douglass hinted at a meeting with a brilliant African man whose insights startled him. But the letter did not name him, and history cannot confirm it. Yet perhaps the truth of Isaac's fate matters less than the truth of his legacy. A man's body can vanish. A name can be lost. But the effect he left, the cracks he struck in the slaveholder's armor, the quiet fire he lit in enslaved hearts, those remained. They rippled outward, invisible yet unstoppable, through plantations, through cities, through politics, through the coming storm of the 1860s. The Civil War would later be explained by tariffs, states' rights, constitutional disputes, and political crises. But long before cannons fired at Fort Sumter, something else had already begun to unravel in the minds of those who had once believed themselves unshakable. Isaac did not start a war. He did not lead a rebellion. He did not write a pamphlet or give a speech. He simply existed calm, intelligent, unbroken in a world that required him to be less than human. And for the men who crossed his path, that was the most unbearable truth of all. His story faded from official record, absorbed into the deeper current of history. But in the whispered songs of the enslaved, in the diaries of the disturbed, in the quiet conversions of men who abandoned everything they once believed, Isaac continued to live, a reminder that sometimes the most powerful resistance is not force, but clarity. Not rebellion, but truth. Not a shout, but a gaze. And that one man, simply by refusing to bow to the lie, can shake the foundations of an entire world.